Chapter 1. Before the render. The moment art learned to breathe like code. The room was dark except for the glow of a laptop screen, the kind of glow that turns skin blue and time irrelevant. Outside, New York was awake in its usual, aggressive way, sirens, engines, laughter echoing off concrete. But inside the small apartment, the world had narrowed to pixels, layers, and an idea that refused to sit still. Cristobal Valenzuela leaned closer to the screen, fingers hovering above the keyboard. On the display, a short video looped endlessly, a blurred figure dissolving into color, reforming into something almost human, then breaking apart again. It wasn't polished. It wasn't efficient. It wasn't even particularly useful, but it felt alive. This isn't just a tool, he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. It's a collaborator. That sentence, half conviction, half question, would later be repeated in interviews, panels, and essays dissecting the rise of creative artificial intelligence. At this moment, though, it was just a thought spoken into the dark, unanswered, unresolved. This was before the render, before the funding rounds, before Hollywood came knocking, before Runway became a name people argued about. 1. The artist before the algorithm. Cristobal did not grow up dreaming of venture capital or valuations. His childhood was shaped less by spreadsheets than by sketchbooks, less by logic trees than by intuition. Raised in Chile, he learned early that images could travel where words could not. Art was not a luxury, it was a language. He drew because it helped him think. He animated because stillness felt dishonest. When he later moved into formal design education, then into advanced art and technology programs, he carried with him a quiet discomfort. Most creative software felt rigid. Powerful, yes, but rigid. Tools demanded obedience. You clicked what they allowed, adjusted what they permitted, rendered what they defined as possible. Creativity, to him, felt messier than that. He gravitated toward code not because he loved programming in the abstract, but because code promised something art software did not: malleability. With enough patience, code could be persuaded to do almost anything. It didn't care about tradition. It didn't care about genre. It cared only about rules, and rules, if you understood them deeply enough, could be bent. Around him, a generation of artists was forming with similar instincts. They were fluent in After Effects and Blender, yes, but also in Python notebooks, neural nets, and datasets scavenged from the internet's chaotic archives. They spoke in hybrids, visual language mixed with technical shorthand. This wasn't Silicon Valley's idea of innovation. It was closer to a studio practice, experimental, iterative, sometimes reckless. And it was quietly converging on a dangerous idea. What if the computer didn't just execute creativity? What if it participated in it? 2. A different kind of intelligence. Artificial intelligence, at the time, was still mostly discussed in functional terms. Recommendation engines, classification systems, optimization problems. Even when neural networks entered the conversation, they were framed as tools for prediction, not imagination. But artists noticed something others overlooked. Machine learning systems were not deterministic in the way traditional software was. They learned patterns statistically. They hallucinated. They failed in strange, sometimes beautiful ways. These failures mattered. A model trained to recognize objects would occasionally see faces in clouds. A generative system would smear textures into impossible shapes, inventing forms no human would deliberately design. To engineers, these were bugs. To artists, they were openings. Cristobal and others like him began treating models less like machines and more like volatile materials, like paint that might react unexpectedly to light, or film stock that responded differently to heat. The question wasn't, what can this AI do efficiently? It was, what happens if I let it surprise me? That question would become Runway's DNA long before Runway existed as a company. 3. Meeting at the intersection. Runway did not begin with a pitch deck. It began with conversations. Cristobal met Alejandro Matamala and others through overlapping circles of art, design, and computational experimentation. They shared frustrations. Creative tools lagged behind creative ambition. AI research felt disconnected from artists who could actually use it. Most AI labs chased benchmarks. Most creative studios chased deadlines. No one was building bridges. In classrooms, studios, and late-night Slack threads, a shared belief took shape. Creative people should not have to become engineers to use AI. AI should meet artists where they are. This belief sounds obvious now. At the time, it bordered on heresy. Machine learning workflows were arcane. You needed GPUs, datasets, command lines. Even generating a simple output could take hours of setup. The barrier wasn't creativity, it was access. What if those barriers disappeared? What if AI tools felt more like sketching than coding? 4. The first experiments. The earliest versions of what would become Runway were not products. They were experiments barely held together by ambition and caffeine. A model that could remove backgrounds from video, not perfectly, but intuitively. A system that stylized footage in real time, bending reality just enough to feel uncanny. An interface that prioritized play over precision. Friends tested them, then friends of friends, then strangers. The feedback was immediate and visceral. This feels wrong, but in a good way. I've never seen my footage behave like this. I don't know how it works, but I want more. Runway's early adopters were not executives. They were motion designers, indie filmmakers, VFX artists working late nights on impossible deadlines. People who understood constraints intimately and recognized freedom when they saw it. Something important happened during those first months. The team realized they weren't just building software. They were building trust. Artists are skeptical by nature. They've been promised miracles before, new tools that would revolutionize creativity, and instead delivered frustration. For Runway to succeed, it couldn't just be powerful. It had to feel respectful. AI couldn't replace the artist. It had to extend them. 5. The ethical shadow. Even in the beginning, unease hovered at the edges of excitement. Where did the data come from? Who owned the outputs? What happened to craft when machines accelerated everything? These questions were not theoretical. They surfaced in conversations with artists who loved the tools but feared their implications. Cristobal felt this tension personally. He was not an outsider disrupting a field he didn't care about. He was the field. The idea that creative labor might be devalued by automation haunted him. But he also knew something else. Creativity had always evolved alongside tools. Photography didn't kill painting. Digital editing didn't kill film. The danger wasn't technology. The danger was exclusion. If AI belonged only to corporations and labs, artists would lose agency. If artists helped shape it, perhaps the future could be negotiated rather than imposed. Runway's strategy, still unspoken, was forming. Democratize access first. Argue about power later. 6. From studio to startup. The transition from collective experiment to formal company was not dramatic. It was reluctant. Founders of creative tools often resist the word startup. It implies scale before intention, growth before meaning. But servers cost money. GPUs were expensive. And interest from users, from institutions, from investors was accelerating. At some point, not becoming a company was no longer a neutral choice. It was a decision to limit impact. So Runway incorporated. The name was deliberate. A runway is a place of transition, a strip of ground where something heavy becomes airborne. It is not the flight itself, but without it, flight is impossible. They did not promise the future of creativity. They promised a place to take off. 7. Early attention. As word spread, something unusual happened. Runway attracted attention from both artists and technologists. AI researchers saw clever abstractions. Designers saw freedom. Filmmakers saw time saved and new aesthetics discovered. Demonstrations circulated online. Short clips showing impossible transformations. Videos that looked expensive but were made quickly. The internet did what it always does. It amplified. With amplification came pressure. Could this scale? Could it survive competition? Could it become a business? The founders felt the weight of expectation without yet having the armor of success. Every decision felt permanent. Every misstep felt existential. Still, the tools improved. Interfaces refined. Models trained. Partnerships hinted at possibility. And quietly, valuations began to be whispered, not yet shouted. 8. Before the world changed. In retrospect, this period would be remembered as the calm before creative AI became a cultural battleground. Before lawsuits. Before labor strikes. Before headlines arguing whether art was being stolen by machines. Before Runway was discussed in the same breath as major studios. Back then, it was simpler. A few people, a shared belief, a screen glowing in the dark. Cristobal watched another render finish. The output wasn't perfect. The edges jittered. The motion was strange. He smiled. Perfection could come later. For now, it was enough to know that something new had entered the world. Something unfinished, unpredictable, and undeniably creative. And this time, the machine wasn't just executing instructions. It was responding. Chapter 2. Models, Money, and the Machine. When creativity became a market signal. By the time Runway began to feel real, to feel like something that might outgrow its makers, the questions stopped being philosophical and started becoming logistical. How many users could the servers handle? How fast could models be trained, deployed, iterated? How long could the team keep absorbing infrastructure costs before the math broke? These were not the questions Cristobal Valenzuela had entered art school dreaming about. But they arrived anyway, indifferent to idealism. Creativity, once released into the world, demanded scaffolding. And scaffolding cost money. 1. The first check. The first serious investor conversation didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened, like so many Runway moments, half improvised, screens shared over video calls, demos running on borrowed GPUs, founders explaining not just what the product did, but why it felt different. Most investors didn't know what to do with that explanation. They were used to pitches framed around efficiency, faster workflows, cheaper labor, higher margins. Runway didn't deny those benefits, but it refused to lead with them. The founders talked instead about creative intuition, about tools that invited play rather than replaced labor. Some investors nodded politely and passed. Others leaned forward. They had seen what generative models were becoming. They understood that the next phase of AI wouldn't be hidden in back-end systems. It would be visible, emotional, controversial. It would touch culture. Runway, they sensed, was not just a product. It was an interface between machines and imagination. When the first check cleared, it wasn't relief Cristobal felt. It was responsibility. Money accelerated everything, including consequences. 2. Scaling the unscalable. Creativity does not scale cleanly. This was the first paradox Runway encountered as growth accelerated. Machine learning infrastructure could be optimized, batch jobs, parallel training, cloud orchestration. But creative workflows resisted standardization. Artists used the same tools in wildly different ways. One person's mistake was another's signature style. Outputs that engineers might want to fix were precisely what users loved. The team learned to resist their own instincts. Not every bug should be eliminated. Not every artifact was an error. Instead of enforcing uniformity, Runway began to embrace variability as a feature. Models were tuned not just for accuracy, but for expressiveness. Interfaces exposed controls that didn't always have obvious outcomes. This baffled some investors. You could simplify this, one suggested. Cristobal shook his head. Then it wouldn't be honest. Honesty, in this context, meant acknowledging that AI-generated media was not a conveyor belt. It was a dialogue. 3. The valuation question. As funding rounds progressed, so did the numbers. Valuations rose quickly, sometimes uncomfortably so. Headlines began using words like unicorn adjacent, breakout, category defining. Comparisons were drawn to other AI startups, but Runway's metrics didn't fit neatly. User growth was strong, but not viral in the social media sense. Revenue existed, but it wasn't the primary story. What investors paid for was optionality. Runway sat at the intersection of multiple massive industries: film and television, advertising, gaming, social media, education, independent creator economies. Every demo hinted at a dozen futures. Licensing deals loomed. Partnerships whispered. Studios watched closely, half excited, half alarmed. For the founders, valuation was a strange mirror. It reflected belief from the outside, but it also distorted internal reality. The product was still fragile, the ethics unresolved, the cultural implications barely understood. And yet, on paper, they were suddenly wealthy, or at least wealth adjacent. Cristobal tried not to look at the numbers too often. He worried that if he did, the work would change. 4. The machine learns faster than culture. As Runway's models improved, outputs crossed a threshold. They stopped looking experimental. They started looking professional. Videos created in minutes resembled sequences that once required full VFX teams. Stylized shots felt intentional rather than accidental. Generative fills erased entire production constraints. This was the moment when curiosity turned into concern. Editors asked, "What happens to our jobs?" VFX artists asked, "Are we being trained out of relevance?" Unions began watching quietly. Runway's inbox filled with praise and fear in equal measure. The founders faced a choice common to transformative technologies: lean into disruption or slow down to negotiate meaning. They chose a third path: integration. Rather than marketing AI as a replacement, Runway positioned it as a collaborator. Tools were framed as accelerants, not authors. Documentation emphasized human control, creative intent, and iterative exploration. But messaging could only do so much. The machine was learning faster than culture could adapt. 5. Hollywood notices. The first serious studio conversations were cautious, almost clinical. Executives watched demos with crossed arms. They asked about legal exposure, intellectual property, and union response. They worried about backlash more than potential. Then they asked to try it. A few internal tests turned into pilots. Pilots turned into exploratory partnerships. Runway's tools slipped quietly into post-production workflows. Background removal here, style transfer there, generative effects filling gaps that budgets couldn't. What surprised the founders most was not resistance, but relief. Editors spoke of deadlines that finally felt humane. Directors talked about visual experimentation without reshoots. Small teams produced work that once demanded armies. Hollywood didn't embrace AI because it wanted to replace artists. It embraced AI because it was exhausted. 6. Licensing, not looting. As adoption grew, so did scrutiny over training data. Critics accused generative models of stealing art. Lawsuits loomed across the industry. The question of consent, who agreed to have their work absorbed into models, became unavoidable. Runway's leadership understood the stakes. If creative AI lost moral legitimacy, no amount of valuation would save it. They invested early in licensing conversations, dataset transparency, and partnerships that respected ownership. This slowed some development. It complicated negotiations. It frustrated investors eager for speed. But it bought something more valuable: credibility. When studios asked, "Are we exposed?" Runway could answer carefully, not dismissively. When artists asked, "Are you exploiting us?" the founders could point to real efforts, not perfect, but sincere. Ethics, they learned, was not a checkbox. It was a cost center, and they were willing to pay it. 7. Wealth without closure. As equity value rose, founders found themselves in an unfamiliar emotional territory. They were, by any external measure, successful. Their company was cited in industry briefings. Their net worths, on paper, had changed dramatically. And yet, nothing felt finished. There was no exit yet, no bell rung, no clean narrative arc. Just more responsibility, more visibility, more expectation. Cristobal sometimes wondered if this was the permanent state of modern founders: materially wealthy, psychologically unfinished. The machine kept learning. The market kept watching. The culture kept arguing. And Runway stood in the middle, both beneficiary and lightning rod. 8. The point of no return. The moment Runway's tools appeared in mainstream creative outputs, music videos, advertising campaigns, streaming content, something shifted. AI-generated visuals were no longer novelties. They were infrastructure. At that point, the question was no longer whether creative AI would matter. It was who would shape it. Runway had crossed a line from experiment to institution, from curiosity to force. And with that crossing came an unavoidable truth. The next chapter would not be written quietly. Chapter 3, Hollywood in the Loop. When the machine entered the studio, and everyone felt it. The first time Runway appeared in a major studio workflow, no one announced it. There was no press release, no celebratory tweet, no triumphant declaration that artificial intelligence had arrived in Hollywood. It simply showed up, quietly, inside a post-production pipeline already strained by deadlines, budgets, and expectations that grew faster than crews could sustain. A junior editor used it to clean up a background. A VFX supervisor tried it on a sequence that would otherwise be cut for cost. A director experimented with an alternate visual style just to see. And then, without ceremony, it stayed. 1. The industry's open secret. Hollywood has always been a place of contradictions. It celebrates creativity while industrializing it. It glorifies auteurs while relying on armies of invisible technicians. It fears disruption publicly while chasing it privately. By the time Runway entered the conversation, the industry was already exhausted. Streaming had multiplied content demand. Budgets were tighter, schedules shorter, audiences more fragmented and more demanding. Everyone wanted innovation. No one wanted instability. Runway's pitch, if it could be called that, wasn't about replacement. It was about relief. This saves us a week. This lets us try something we'd never get approved. This makes the impossible manageable. Executives nodded. Creatives leaned in. Lawyers took notes. 2. The first studio room. Cristobal remembered the first closed-door studio demo vividly. The room was cold, windowless, and lined with faces trained to reveal nothing. Executives sat with hands folded. Legal teams flanked them. A few creatives hovered at the edges, curious but cautious. Runway's interface appeared on the screen. No jargon, no code, just footage and transformation. A background vanished cleanly. A stylized sequence bloomed into something uncanny but controlled. A shot that would have cost hundreds of thousands of dollars appeared in minutes. Silence. Then a question from the far end of the table. Can this be turned off? Cristobal smiled carefully. Only if you want it to be. That answer mattered. Hollywood did not want a machine that took over. It wanted a machine that listened. 3. Creative acceleration and quiet fear. As Runway's tools embedded themselves deeper into production, something subtle changed in how creatives talked about their work. They stopped saying, "We can't." They started saying, "What if?" This was exhilarating and unsettling. For decades, creative limitations had been external: budgets, time, physics. Now some of those constraints dissolved. The limiting factor became taste, intention, ethics. Not everyone welcomed that responsibility. Some artists felt empowered. Others felt exposed. If the machine can do this, one VFX artist asked quietly, what exactly am I being paid for? The question had no easy answer. Runway's founders resisted simplistic narratives. They spoke about augmentation, co-creation, new roles. But they also listened to fear, anger, and grief from people whose identities were bound to their craft. This wasn't just technological change. It was existential. 4. Labor, lines, and the breaking point. The backlash did not arrive all at once. It accumulated. First, online debates, then op-eds, then closed-door union meetings. When writers and actors went on strike, AI became a flashpoint. Even though Runway focused primarily on visuals, the cultural moment did not discriminate. Generative tools were lumped together, accused collectively of eroding labor rights. Cristobal watched the discourse carefully. He understood the fear. He also knew that the genie would not return to the bottle. The question wasn't whether AI would exist in creative industries. It was whether artists would have agency within it. Runway publicly supported clearer boundaries, consent frameworks, and human oversight. Privately, the founders wrestled with their own contradictions. building powerful tools while advocating restraint. There were days when progress felt like betrayal. 5. Partnerships, not conquests. Unlike some AI companies that pursued aggressive enterprise expansion, Runway chose its partnerships carefully. They favored collaborations over blanket deployments, pilots over mandates, dialogue over disruption. This approach slowed growth in the short term, but deepened trust. Studios appreciated that Runway didn't frame itself as inevitable. It framed itself as optional. And paradoxically, that made it harder to say no. Licensing deals followed, not extractive, but negotiated. Custom integrations respected existing workflows rather than bulldozing them. Education initiatives trained artists to use the tools, not fear them. Runway didn't want to own creativity. It wanted to be invited into it. 6. The moment the audience noticed. For a long time, audiences didn't know or care how images were made. Then they started noticing. A music video felt too fluid. An ad looked impossible. A film sequence sparked rumors. Was this AI? Became a new kind of credit. Some viewers were delighted. Others felt deceived. Social media turned every frame into a forensic exercise. Runway had crossed into public consciousness. With that came a new kind of responsibility, not just to users or partners, but to culture itself. Cristobal began speaking less like a founder and more like a steward. He talked about intent, transparency, and the need for shared norms. He acknowledged uncertainty openly. We're still figuring this out, he said in one interview. And we should be. 7. Wealth meets weight. As Runway's influence grew, so did the material rewards. Equity values climbed with each successful partnership, each demonstration of real-world adoption. The company was now routinely mentioned alongside the most important creative AI players in the world. On paper, the founders had made it, but wealth did not bring clarity. It brought scrutiny. It brought expectation. It brought the uncomfortable knowledge that their decisions shaped livelihoods they would never meet. Cristobal found himself thinking less about exit scenarios and more about legacy. What would Runway be remembered for? Empowerment or erosion? The machine did not answer that question. People would. 8. The loop tightens. By the end of this chapter, Runway was no longer outside Hollywood. It was in the loop, not controlling it, not dominating it, but undeniably part of its nervous system. Every creative choice reverberated faster. Every ethical question echoed louder. The feedback loop between technology and art tightened, accelerating both innovation and anxiety. And somewhere between the render and the release, between the artist and the algorithm, a new creative order was being negotiated in real time. Quietly, messily, inevitably. Chapter 4. What an artist owes the future. Legacy, responsibility, and the quiet work of choosing what comes next. By the time Runway felt unavoidable, Cristobal Valenzuela had learned to sit with silence. Not the silence of absence, but the kind that follows momentum. The moment after applause fades, after metrics update, after the market reacts and waits for the next move. It was a silence heavy with consequence. The kind that asks a question without offering an answer. What had they built? Not just a company, not just a suite of models, but a capability, one that would outlive its creators, be copied, reinterpreted, misused, improved, and woven into creative culture long after any single founder stepped aside. The question that remained was not how powerful Runway could become. It was what kind of power it should be allowed to have. 1. The strange weight of success. Success, in the abstract, is easy to desire. In practice, it is disorienting. Runway's founders found themselves in a position that earlier versions of themselves could not have imagined. Influential in a global industry, financially secure in ways that removed old anxieties, and yet burdened by a sense that the work was far from finished. The wealth was real. Equity value crystallized through secondary liquidity, valuations discussed in headlines, partnerships that turned experimentation into durable enterprise. But money, once sufficient, stopped feeling like an outcome and began to feel like evidence. Evidence that people believed. evidence that expectations were set, evidence that mistakes would scale. Cristobal noticed that the more successful Runway became, the less satisfying winning felt. There was no finish line, only a widening field of responsibility. 2. The artist's dilemma. At the heart of Runway's journey was a contradiction that never fully resolved. Artists build tools to express themselves. Entrepreneurs build systems to scale. Runway had to do both. As the platform matured, it became clear that the most important decisions were no longer technical. They were curatorial. What features to prioritize? What defaults to set? What friction to keep deliberately in place? Removing all friction would maximize speed, but speed, unexamined, can flatten meaning. Cristobal began asking a different kind of question in internal meetings. Does this make people better artists, or just faster producers? The answers were rarely obvious. Sometimes the same feature did both. Sometimes it depended on context. Sometimes it depended on who held the power. Runway's strategy evolved accordingly, not toward maximal automation, but toward intentional constraint. Tools were designed to invite choice, not eliminate it. To suggest, not dictate. This was not the most efficient path to dominance. It was the most honest one. 3. Ownership, authorship, and the line that moves. As generative media became ubiquitous, the line between human and machine authorship blurred. Who made an image shaped by a model trained on millions of prior works? Who deserved credit when inspiration arrived statistically rather than consciously? These questions haunted the founders, not because they threatened profit, but because they threatened meaning. Runway invested in attribution tools, licensing frameworks, and transparency initiatives that acknowledged lineage rather than erasing it. Not because regulation demanded it, but because the alternative felt corrosive. Creativity, Cristobal believed, was a conversation across time. AI did not invent that conversation, but it amplified it. The danger lay in pretending the machine was neutral. It wasn't. Every model reflected choices: what to include, what to exclude, what to optimize for. To deny that was to abdicate responsibility. 4. The founder as steward. At some point, Cristobal stopped thinking of himself as a founder in the traditional sense. Founders chase product-market fit. Stewards protect ecosystems. Runway had crossed that threshold. The company's influence meant that even small design decisions rippled outward. A default setting could shape how thousands of creators approached their craft. A pricing model could determine who had access and who didn't. Stewardship required humility, the recognition that no team, however well-intentioned, could anticipate every consequence. It also required restraint. Not every capability needed to be shipped immediately. Not every breakthrough needed to be public. Not every competitive advantage needed to be exploited. This ran counter to startup orthodoxy. But Runway was no longer just a startup. It was infrastructure. 5. The question of exit. Investors asked, gently at first, then more directly, what was the end game? An acquisition? A public offering? A platform that outlived its founders? Cristobal had learned to answer carefully. He knew that liquidity events mattered, not just for investors, but for employees whose lives had been shaped by years of intense work. He also knew that an exit would inevitably change Runway's incentives. The challenge was not to avoid outcomes, but to choose them deliberately. Runway explored partnerships that preserved autonomy, growth paths that didn't require surrendering values, structures that allowed for sustainability rather than extraction. Wealth, in this context, was not the goal. Continuity was. 6. Looking back without nostalgia. Occasionally, Cristobal would return, mentally, to that early room with the glowing laptop, the imperfect render, the sense that something alive had emerged unexpectedly from code. He resisted nostalgia. The early days were not purer. They were simply smaller, easier to hold in one mind. The present was messy, but also more honest. The machine had grown. So had the questions. What mattered was not preserving the past, but remaining accountable to the future. 7. What we leave behind. Every generation of artists inherits tools they did not choose. Brushes, cameras, software. AI would be no different. The responsibility of Runway's founders, Cristobal believed, was not to decide how future artists should create, but to ensure they could create on their own terms, with tools that respected them. That meant resisting narratives of inevitability, resisting the idea that efficiency was the highest value, resisting the temptation to reduce creativity to output. In one quiet conversation, Cristobal said something that never made it into a headline. If these tools erase struggle entirely, they'll erase meaning with it. The goal isn't to make art effortless. It's to make it possible. 8. The render continues. There was no final scene, no closing frame. Runway did not end with a sale, a bell ringing, or a triumphant montage. It continued, as all living systems do, through iteration, negotiation, and care. The machine kept learning. Artists kept arguing. The world kept watching. And somewhere between code and culture, a fragile balance held, maintained not by certainty, but by attention. Cristobal closed his laptop one evening after another long day of decisions without clear answers. Outside, the city hummed. Inside, the silence returned, not empty, but full. He knew now that the most important work would never appear in a demo. It would appear in what they chose not to build, in the pace they refused to accelerate beyond wisdom. In the future artists would inherit and reshape. The render was never finished. And that, perhaps, was the point.